She thought she could say whatever she wanted. She thought no one would call her out. But what she didn't expect, a response so powerful it left the entire cafe in silence. When a rude woman insulted a black man in a crowded cafe, she assumed everyone would be on her side. She spoke loudly, expecting nods of agreement. But after hearing what he had to say, she realized she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you love stories about standing up for what's right, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Because by the time he was done speaking, she wasn't the one in control anymore. It was a quiet Saturday morning at a small cafe in the city. People were enjoying their coffee, chatting softly, or just scrolling through their phones. The smell of fresh pastries filled the air. David Cole was sitting by the window, reading a book, minding his own business. He wasn't in a rush. He wasn't bothering anyone. Just a man enjoying his morning in peace. David wasn't just anyone, though. He was a well-respected writer, known for his powerful words and deep reflections on society. But today, he wasn't looking to start a conversation. He just wanted a quiet moment to himself. That peace didn't last long, because that's when she walked in. Karen Thompson, an entitled woman in her mid-40s, entered the cafe loud and impatient. She was the type who believed the world revolved around her. The type who never waited in line, who looked at service workers like they were beneath her. And today, she was already in a bad mood. She walked up to the counter, ordered her usual overpriced coffee, then turned around to find a seat. Her eyes scanned the cafe, looking for the perfect spot. Then she saw David's table. There was an empty chair next to him. She wanted it. Without a second thought, she marched over. "Excuse me," she said sharply. "I need this seat." David glanced up, his expression calm. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I'd rather sit alone." Karen wasn't used to hearing no. Her eyebrows shot up. "Are you serious?" David nodded politely and turned back to his book. Karen let out an exaggerated sigh. "Wow. Figures someone like you wouldn't have any manners." The cafe went silent. People turned to look. The air shifted. David slowly closed his book, his eyes meeting hers. "Tell me, ma'am," he said, his voice steady. "What exactly do you mean by someone like me?" And just like that, the real moment began. The cafe was silent. Everyone had heard Karen's words. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. David looked at her, his expression calm but firm. Karen folded her arms. "You heard me," she said, tilting her head. "People like you. So rude, so inconsiderate. You think you own the place, but you don't." David nodded slowly, as if he were carefully considering her words. "I see," he said. "And by people like me, you mean what exactly?" Karen scoffed. "Oh, come on. Don't play dumb. You know what I mean." David leaned back in his chair, still calm. "No, ma'am, I don't. See, words matter, and I'd like to know what you meant by that statement. Please, explain it to me." Karen hesitated. She wasn't expecting to be challenged. Not like this. She looked around the cafe as if searching for support, but all she found were staring eyes. A young woman sitting nearby put down her coffee cup, watching intently. A barista behind the counter stopped mid-pour. The energy in the room had changed. Karen's confidence wavered, but she doubled down. "I just mean that some people, certain people, don't know how to be polite." David nodded again, keeping his voice measured. "And those certain people, would they happen to look like me?" Karen's face turned red. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to," David replied. The room felt smaller. Karen's mouth opened, but no words came out. David's voice remained calm, steady. Let me tell you something, ma'am. You walked into this cafe assuming you were more important than everyone else. You demanded something that wasn't yours, and when I didn't comply, you insulted me." Karen scoffed, trying to regain her confidence. "I wasn't insulting you." David raised an eyebrow. "Then what do you call it?" Karen opened her mouth, then shut it. The cafe was dead silent. David continued, his voice never rising. "You see, people like me, we've heard these words before. We've seen these looks before. We've felt the weight of people assuming we don't belong. But here's the thing. You don't get to decide that." Karen's hands clenched into fists. "Oh, please. Now you're trying to make this into something it's not." David smiled. "Am I?" A man sitting near the counter shook his head. "Nah, he's right. I've seen this too many times." Karen's head snapped toward him. "Excuse me?" Another woman at a different table set down her coffee. "No, he's right. You walked in here acting like you owned the place and treated him like he was beneath you." Karen's face flushed. David tapped his fingers on the table. "The funny thing is, I was sitting here, minding my own business, before you walked in and decided to make me a problem." Karen scoffed, trying to grab hold of her argument again. "You're twisting things. I just wanted to sit down. That's all." David nodded. "And instead of accepting my choice to sit alone, you insulted me." She rolled her eyes. "Oh, come on. It wasn't that serious." David smiled. "Wasn't it?" A barista behind the counter suddenly spoke. "Actually, ma'am, you've done this before." Karen turned in shock. "Excuse me." The young barista, a girl no older than 20, crossed her arms. "This isn't the first time you've treated someone this way. You always come in here demanding things, acting like you're better than everyone." Karen's jaw dropped. The barista shook her head. "Honestly, we've all had enough of it." A few people murmured in agreement. Karen turned back to David, her eyes flashing. "So what? You're the hero now? The big man teaching me a lesson?" David shrugged. "I don't need to teach you a lesson. The people around you are already doing that." Karen glanced around, realizing something for the first time. The cafe wasn't on her side. The people who usually stayed silent, they were speaking up. And suddenly, she wasn't the loudest voice in the room anymore. David leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the table. "Let me ask you something, ma'am. Why do you feel the need to speak to people the way you do?" Karen's lips parted, but no words came out. David continued. "Do you think it makes you powerful? Do you think demanding things and speaking down to people makes you important?" Karen swallowed, her throat dry. David shook his head. "It doesn't. Real power, real importance, that comes from respect. And respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn." Karen's face was burning now. She grabbed her purse, her body stiff. She had lost. David sat back. "Maybe next time, before you speak to someone like they're beneath you, you'll think about this moment." The room stayed quiet. Karen turned on her heel and stormed toward the exit. Before she could leave, David said one last thing. "I hope, for your sake, that one day you understand what real respect looks like." And just like that, the conversation was over. Karen walked out, her head down, her shoulders tight. No one said goodbye to her. No one cared that she left. The cafe moved on without her. David sighed and reopened his book. Someone from across the room called out, "That was the best thing I've seen all week." A few people clapped quietly. A woman at the next table smiled at David. "That was impressive." David chuckled. Sometimes the best response isn't to argue. It's just to make people see themselves for who they really are. And with that, he went back to his coffee, while the cafe returned to its peace. The cafe was still quiet, but now the energy had shifted completely. Karen stood frozen near the door, gripping her purse so tightly her knuckles were white. She had come in expecting to demand what she wanted, to walk over people the way she always did. But this time, it didn't work. David hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't insulted her. And somehow that made it so much worse. He had let her own words expose her. She swallowed hard, looking around the cafe. Usually, when things got tense, she could rely on other people to agree with her. But today, no one was backing her up. In fact, the people she had ignored all these times, the customers, the baristas, the quiet ones who usually just watched her act entitled, they were the ones staring at her now. And their expressions weren't sympathetic. They were tired. David turned another page in his book, his voice as steady as ever. "I see you're still here," he said casually. "Was there something else you needed?" Karen bristled. "I don't need anything from you." David nodded. "That's good to hear, because for a moment it seemed like you needed control, like you needed to make someone feel small to feel important." Karen let out a small, bitter laugh. "Oh, please, you're acting like I committed a crime. I just wanted a seat. That's it." David looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You wanted more than a seat. You wanted obedience." Someone in the back of the cafe murmured in agreement. Karen's face flushed. "That's ridiculous." David tilted his head. "Is it? Think about it. If I had let you sit here without question, would you have still insulted me? Or would you have acted like I didn't exist?" Karen opened her mouth, but for the first time in her life, she didn't have an answer. Because deep down, she knew he was right. David set his book down completely, folding his hands in front of him. "I don't expect you to admit anything, but I will say this. If the way you treat people depends on whether or not they give you what you want, that says more about you than anything else." Karen felt her pulse pounding. "I don't need a lecture from you." David smiled slightly. "You didn't need to insult me either, but you did. And now you don't like that people are holding you accountable for it." Karen felt like the room was closing in on her. She had spent years acting this way, and no one had ever dared to stop her before. No one had ever spoken to her like this. She'd been put in her place before, sure, but never like this. Never in a way that made her question herself. She let out a sharp breath. "You think you're better than me." David shook his head. "And no, ma'am. I think people like you are used to thinking you're better than everyone else. And today, you learned that you're not." A few customers clapped quietly. Karen flinched at the sound. It wasn't loud, but it was humiliating. She had lost. But as Karen turned to leave, David's calm voice reached her again. "One last thing, ma'am." She froze, her back still to him. "Before you go, I hope you take a moment to think about what just happened. Not just how it felt to lose control, but how it felt to have people tell you the truth. Because that truth, it's not just for today. It's for every other time you've walked into a place and treated someone like they didn't matter." Karen's shoulders stiffened. "The world isn't made for you to walk over people. It's made for us to walk alongside each other," David said. "You're not the main character in everyone else's life. You're just a person, like the rest of us. And maybe, if you start treating people that way, you'll find a little more respect for yourself." Karen turned around, her face pale. David held up a hand. "You don't have to respond. Just take a moment to think, that's all." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. She nodded once, then turned and walked out the door. The cafe stayed silent for a moment longer. Then the room started to shift. The tension broke. People began whispering, talking softly to each other. That was something. one woman said, smiling at David. The barista nodded. Honestly, that needed to happen. A man near the counter added, "It's about time someone said it. She's been doing that for years." David picked up his book again, his expression calm. Sometimes, the best response isn't to argue. It's just to make people see themselves for who they really are. And with that, the cafe returned to its usual peace. Karen had left. But the impact of what just happened, that would stay with everyone in that room for a long time. As Karen left the cafe, her mind raced. She had walked into the room feeling confident, self-assured. She thought she could say anything and no one would stand up to her. But now, she realized something. She was the one people were tired of. Karen thought her sharp words and demanding presence made her powerful. She thought people respected her. But now she saw that it wasn't respect. It was silence. And today, silence wasn't what she got. When David spoke, he hadn't just called her out. He made her see herself through other people's eyes. She saw the barista's tired expression, the way customers had nodded in agreement with David, and the quiet satisfaction on their faces as she walked out. No one had said anything directly to her before. They had just endured it, probably hoping she would leave. But today, someone stood up. It wasn't just about that moment in the cafe. It was about every time she had walked into a room, demanded things, and assumed people would fall in line. Every time she brushed off her behavior as just being direct or having a bad day. She realized as she walked down the street that this wasn't about David. This was about her. Her words had finally caught up to her. And now, she didn't know how to handle it. Back in the cafe, David returned to his book. He wasn't looking for applause. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He had simply told the truth. And the truth, it was powerful. People were still talking about what had happened. A couple sitting by the counter leaned in close, whispering, "Did you see her face when he said that? I've never seen her look so embarrassed." The barista smiled quietly as she cleared a table. She needed that. I can't tell you how many times she's come in here bossing people around. It's about time someone stood their ground. David didn't pay much attention to the chatter. He wasn't interested in winning points or proving he was right. For him, it wasn't about humiliating Karen. It was about something bigger. It was about reminding people of their worth. And as he sat there, turning another page in his book, he felt at peace. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't lost his temper. All he did was speak calmly, clearly, and truthfully. And that had changed everything. After Karen left the cafe, a quiet sense of relief filled the room. David looked up from his book, catching a few glances from the baristas and customers who remained. Some nodded in his direction, silently thanking him. David smiled faintly. He hadn't set out to humiliate anyone. He hadn't planned on delivering a grand speech. He just spoke the truth as he saw it, calmly and clearly. The barista behind the counter whispered something to her co-worker. The second barista nodded, then walked over to David's table. "Can I get you another coffee?" "On the house," she said. David shook his head. "Thanks, but I'm good. I just hope she's okay." The barista hesitated. "You hope she's okay?" David nodded. "She was wrong, no question. But maybe now she'll think twice before acting like that again. Maybe she'll grow from this." The barista smiled. "You're a better person than me. I've seen her come in here and be rude so many times. I'd be happy if she never came back." David chuckled. "I'm not saying she'll change overnight. But sometimes, all it takes is one moment. One conversation. It doesn't have to be a big argument. Just someone willing to stand their ground and say, 'No, this isn't okay.' A young man sitting at a nearby table leaned over. "What you said back there, that was impressive. Most people would have just ignored her or gotten mad. But you kept your cool." David shrugged. "People like her expect anger. They expect you to lash out so they can say, 'See, I was right.' But when you stay calm and make them think, that's when they really start to reflect." The man nodded. "Well, I'll remember that next time someone tries to push me around." David glanced around the cafe. The atmosphere was lighter now. People were back to sipping their coffee, chatting softly, scrolling through their phones. The tension from earlier had melted away. And yet, something had changed. Maybe Karen would never come back. Maybe she'd continue her old ways somewhere else. But for everyone in that cafe, the experience left a mark. They saw what it looked like when someone stood up for themselves without anger, without shouting, just with truth. David picked up his book again. It wasn't about being a hero. It wasn't about making a scene. It was about respect. Because respect isn't given based on who's the loudest or the most demanding. Respect is earned by how you treat others. And that was the lesson Karen walked away with that day, whether she realized it yet or not. Karen came in thinking she was the most important person in the room. But by the time she left, the entire cafe had turned against her. David didn't yell. He didn't argue. He simply stood his ground calmly and let his words speak for themselves. And in that moment, the crowd saw Karen for who she really was. But here's the real question. Do you think Karen learned her lesson? Or will she continue treating people the same way? Let us know what you think in the comments. If you've ever seen someone stand up to a bully with nothing more than their words, we want to hear your story. And if you enjoy moments like this, moments where the underdog takes a stand, make sure to hit that like button, share this with a friend, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories. Because at the end of the day, respect isn't about shouting the loudest. It's about staying true to yourself, even when it's hard. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.